Hello, James here and welcome to another LPJ Models video. In this video I'll take an in-depth look at removing items from the sprue, cleaning them up and eventually gluing them together. So in this video I'm using some donor sprues from the Takom M3 grant. I'll also be showing you some tools and how they can be useful, and I'll also be going through a small selection of glues. I'll also be looking at removing photo etch from the sprues and what glue to use with it. In the first part of this video, we're going to be looking at removing items from the sprues. What you're going to need are some decent sprue cutters, and also a decent hobby knife with a sharp blade. My hobby knife of choice is a Swan Morton No. 3 handle with a 10A blade. So I'm going to remove this part from the sprue. I'm going to be using my Xuron sprue cutters. The nice thing about sprue cutters is they trim the part without damaging the plastic. The best way to use these is to hold them parallel to the surface you're going to cut and firmly apply pressure until you hear them click. Sprue cutters are ideal for removing most items from the sprues. Only the finest parts I'd recommend using a hobby knife for. You can see here where the part has been separated from the sprue with the sprue cutters. The cleanup won't be too bad at all. The sprue cutters even managed to trim off this Edward 148 pitot tube. When removing parts this delicate, be careful not to damage the plastic. For this tiny part of an Edward FW190 seat, I'm going to use the hobby knife. It's best to use a firm but even pressure to remove these parts. When dealing with pieces so small, I try and cut as close to the part as possible to avoid further cleanup. So next up, I'm going to be cleaning up the parts. You'll need a hobby knife with a sharp fresh blade, some fine sandpaper, this is 2000 grit, and also varying grades of sanding sticks. For this piece I'm going to be using a standard emery board. You can buy these in packs of 5 for about £1. There are usually 2 grades of abrasive on an emery board. I'm using the finer one and holding it parallel to the part while sanding off the sprue nub. You may need a few passes to get a result you're happy with. To finish it off, I lightly sanded and polished the area with a very fine grade sanding stick. This transmission housing has a complex shape and will be hard to clean up. Not only are there sprue nubs, but there's also a seam line to remove. Firstly, I removed the sprue nubs from the rear side with my emery board. After a few passes, the area was suitably smooth. The seam line and nubs on the round part of the housing were going to be a little bit more tricky. I used the fine side of the emery board to sand off the nub. When sanding round pieces, it's essential to follow the curve of the piece, otherwise you'll end up with a flat spot. I then used a finer grade sanding stick. With this, I sanded the seam line around the transmission housing. Once I had removed most of the seam line, it was time to polish the part with some fine sandpaper. This sandpaper is really fine at 2000 grit and gives a really nice finish. Remember to always follow the curve, or you will end up with some nasty flat spots. The white spot you can see on this part is a stress mark from when I removed it from the sprue. As long as there isn't a little indentation, this will be fine and won't be seen later. Seam lines on small tubular parts can be a pain. To remove them, I use a sharp hobby knife and some extra thin cement. I start by scraping the seam line off with a sharp 10A blade. It's important that you don't scrape too hard and misshape the part. After you finish scraping, there may be a slight raised edge. You can either attack this with sandpaper, or as I do, with Tamiya extra thin cement. I run some Tamiya extra thin over the part to blend in the seam line. The glue will soften any remaining marks and help blend them into the surface, without a need for sanding. Okay, let's take a look at some photo etch. Photo etch parts can be very small and fragile, so some extra care may be needed. For this part, I used a 10A blade and cut as close to the piece as I could. Sometimes though, the parts may ping away. To stop the tiny parts pinging away, I use some masking tape. I stick this on the back of the photo etch fret. This way, when you cut off the piece, it won't fly away and get eaten by the carpet monster. When cleaning up tiny bits of photo etch, a good pair of tweezers is ideal. Here I'm using some reverse action tweezers and an emery board. And that's the photo etch part cleaned up. Now, let's look at some glue. These are the three main glues I use. I've got Tamiya Extra Thin Cement Quick Setting, which is perfect for tiny jobs. I also use MIG Ammo Extra Thin Cement. This has got a really long brush applicator with a high capacity. I also use Mr. Cement Deluxe. This is a slow drying glue. It can give you lots of working time, perfect for larger parts or parts that need to be placed carefully into position. Let's start with the Ammo Extra Thin Cement. This is a really useful multi-purpose glue. This can be used by painting both mating surfaces with the glue and placing the part together. The glue can also be run along any join lines. The capillary action draws the glue into the gap, creating a tight bond. Next up, I'm going to be using the Tamiya Extra Thin Quick Setting Cement. This bolt had to be glued onto the suspension arm, and the extra thin quick setting glue was the perfect job for this. After I put down a small drop of glue, I picked up the bolt and pushed it into place. The glue dries very quickly, so the bolt was immediately stuck. The Mr. Cement Deluxe slow drying glue can be great for large parts like this. It gives you a little bit extra working time to line things up correctly. As before, I brushed the glue onto both mating surfaces and then pushed them together. Now I'll be showing you how I stick down photo etch parts. For this you'll need some decent superglue. I use Rocket Rapid. You'll need something on which to place the superglue, something to apply it, and of course your model parts. First up, place your superglue on a non-porous surface. You can use foil, plastic, anything like that. The reason I use Rocket Rapid is it has a fairly slow setting time. I place the glue down in small dots on the area which I'm gluing. Be careful not to get the superglue on any areas you don't want. It's quite tricky to remove. When the glue was down, it was time to carefully put the photo etch part into place. When it was in the correct position, I pressed it down with a clean toothpick. This is just to make sure the part adheres correctly. You can use this technique when gluing photo etch to plastic and photo etch to photo etch. And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed my first in-depth tutorial video, and I'll be looking forward to providing you with more tutorial content in the future to help you out on your modelling journey. And here's a sneak peek of the model I've been working on. It's the Takom M3 Grant in 1/35 scale, This will be a painting and weathering video and will be up on my YouTube channel soon. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button below. And if you've got any questions, comments or tips you'd like to share yourself, don't forget to leave a comment. And if you haven't already subscribed, the button's below. I'm James Can, this is LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.